Hello and welcome back. This is the week 9 lecture. So now that we are finished with essay 2, we move on to our third unit of the semester, which is definition. So this week we talk about definition, and we are starting with the basics. So we're going to be looking at some dictionaries. We're going to be looking up the definitions of words. But I really want us to pay attention to all the different elements that go into a standard formal definition. There's a lot more than we might initially expect. So we'll start by defining words here in week 9. By next week, though, we're going to get a bit more complex, a bit more ambitious. So once we learn how to find and utilize the definitions of words, we can start defining bigger things. We can start to define groups of people. We can start to define concepts or bigger ideas that might be interesting to us. And as you can probably imagine, that's what we'll be doing eventually for essay 2. For essay 3. This is our third unit. So after we get the basics of definition down, we're going to talk about a few other sort of related writing strategies or techniques, beginning next week with classification, and we'll also cover examples. But these strategies are somewhat self-explanatory. We already know what a lot of these words mean, so it's not so much about learning, what they are. It's more about learning how to best utilize them in our own writing. And that's what essay 3 will give us a chance to do. But let's just start by talking about definition today. This will be a little basic. We're going back to the very start. This should be review for a lot of us. I know we've looked up words before. We've all probably used dictionaries before. Of course, nowadays we have online dictionaries, so you can really find the meaning of any word very, very quickly. So that's going to come in handy for us this week. So I know this might seem a little obvious here at the start, but we want to start with the basics so we can then make a jump or a leap next week into some more complex work. But let's just start by talking about what a definition is. So it's a technique, it's sort of a method that we use to set boundaries for things. I think that's a really useful way to start thinking about it. A definition sets the boundary of the thing that is being defined, whether it's some kind of inanimate object, it could be a person, it could be a concept, it could be an emotion or a value. But by defining it, we explain what it is, but also what it isn't. We sort of give it the ground that is allowed to it. And that way we are setting boundaries of that word or for that concept. So this is really kind of a standard way that we make ourselves understood in writing and in speech. Now, we might not often be defining individual words for people, but we're often going to be defining other things, how we feel, how we think about something. So there's going to be a certain amount of explanation. There's going to be a certain amount of comparing and contrasting as we try to make ourselves understood. But throughout all of that, by providing an extended definition, we are establishing sort of a framework or boundaries for whatever it is that we're talking about. Here's what it is, here's what it isn't, here's what it does, here's how far it goes, here's how we can understand it. So we often say in composition, if you want to be understood, you really have to use definition. It's one of these basic writing skills that we all must use. So I want us to think about two different kinds of definition now, and we're going to be using both throughout the next few weeks. So let's start with the one that we already know. Formal definitions. These are dictionary definitions. These are what we've often experienced before. So these are the standard dictionary definitions of words. Okay, so we can look these up, we can use these, and we will be using these here to get started at the beginning of the week. So that's a formal definition, and those often come in handy. We need to know those. In some cases, we might even need to repeat some of that if we're dealing with an unfamiliar word or a word that some of our readers or audience members might not be familiar with. These are easy to find. We know how to look up words online. We know how to use online dictionaries. But I want us to pay attention to some of the different elements that we can find in a formal definition. So for this week, for our purposes this week, I would like everybody to use Merriam-Webster's online dictionary. There are many other perfectly fine dictionaries out there. You guys can obviously use others when you're doing other stuff. But this week, I want us to all be using the same service, the same dictionary, the same website, so we're all looking at the same kinds of elements. I would like consistency across the board, because if you're using Oxford or Collins or even like dictionary.com, they're going to have a lot of the same info for any given word, but that info might be arranged or presented differently. You might have to look for it. You might have to click on a few links or do some navigating, and I don't know those other websites as well. Merriam-Webster is my preferred site. I used to have an old dictionary, a real physical dictionary that I used for years. Now, like everybody else, I just visit the website. But the sort of layout I'm going to give you guys as we walk through the different elements that we can find in a formal definition, I'm giving you the way they appear in Merriam-Webster's. Okay? I can't vouch for the other sites. I can't vouch for the other dictionaries. So for our assignment this week, for our upcoming discussion post, I want everybody to use Merriam-Webster's online dictionary. That's our source. That's where we need to go. So we're going to find a lot of different things in addition to the standard basic explanation of what the word means. Okay, so I thought we could just follow along with a quick example. So I'm going to give you a word. I've also put this into the week 9 module. So this is the word I'm using as an example. You guys can obviously start looking for words of your own, words that you like, words that you're interested in, some of the words that you might be choosing from for our assignment. But for now, let's just use an example that I picked out. So the word ephemeral. Okay, you can punch that in if you look at the spelling in the week 9 module, you can type it in for yourself and you can follow along with me as we take a look at all the stuff that goes in to the definition of this word. Okay, so if you type it in, if you just look straight for the definition, you see it. It means lasting for a very short time. But there's a lot of other info that we need to sift through. So really the first thing that you're going to notice when you look up the word is a sort of classification system. They first sort of tell you what type of speech this word is. And you might notice for a lot of words, they can be different types of speech depending on how they're being used. So for example, ephemeral is normally used as an adjective. Normally. Okay? So that's really the first definition that you're going to see. When you first look it up on almost any of the services, but certainly on Merriam-Webster's, you're going to see it considered first and foremost as an adjective, because that's normally how we use it. This is a word that describes other things. This is a word that describes oftentimes other nouns, other people, places, or things. Animals as well, or plants could often be described as ephemeral. So normally we use it as an adjective. But if you scroll down and read more, you'll notice that it can also be a noun. We can also refer to an ephemeral as a thing. That's a much less common usage, but it is there. Okay? So the very first thing Merriam-Webster's does for us is it tells us what kind of speech it is. Is it an adjective? Is it a noun? Is it a verb? Can it be more than one? We need to know that. So we start with a really basic classification system, and classification is another one of these writing strategies that we'll be using in these upcoming weeks. So when we classify, we're just grouping stuff together, right? We're organizing stuff based on what it's similar to. Right? Does it share traits with other things that are similar? We can put those in their own category or their own group or their own classification. So that's what we're doing with these types of speech. We have nouns, we have verbs, we have adjectives, we have adverbs, and in many cases, one word can serve multiple purposes. Okay, it can be multiple types of speech. So that's the very first thing we'll see at the very top. And then we'll get the actual formal definition, the explanation as to what the word means. So we know it's lasting. This word means lasting for a short time. Very brief. Okay, so those are the first couple of things that we'll notice, but there's more. Okay, so after the type of speech, and then after we get the definition itself, oh yeah, you'll also notice a pronunciation guide. That's also near the top of your screen. Should be right underneath the type of speech that it is. You can even listen to the word pronounced. You'll also get it spelled out phonetically for you so you can understand how to pronounce it. If you're still not sure, you can listen to an audio file of somebody else pronouncing it. So you are comfortable using the word not only in writing, but also in speech. So you'll notice that. And then if we go down the list of what else we can locate as part of the definition, so yeah, the definition itself, I would say that's part 3. So classification, pronunciation, what the word means, and then underneath what we would think of as just that formal definition, you see a bunch of other stuff. So pay attention to some of that additional material. You're going to get examples of the word, right? So the example Merriam-Webster's uses on their website is the mayfly, which is a type of animal. It's an insect. And we can describe the mayfly as an ephemeral being because they only live for a very short time, like a day. Right, so that's an easy example that will help us to understand what the word means by giving us that concrete example of something that actually is ephemeral, right? Something that lasts for only a short time. So we can use it for animals, we could use it for plants, we could use it for emotions, we could use it for events that only last for a very short time. So we'll get multiple examples. I think their first example is the mayfly. So you should always look at those specific examples. That's another strategy we're going to be using in Unit 3, examples. An example is simply an individual instance that proves something larger, that illustrates a larger concept or helps us to understand something bigger. So we kind of already know that. We maybe didn't have a good definition for the word example, but that's really all an example is. It's an individual instance. And often you'll provide several of them to prove a larger point or to illustrate or represent some meaning that you are trying to capture. So you've already learned probably in previous English classes that if you're making an argument, if you're trying to prove a thesis, you need good specific examples. And we can see why. It just helps you to be understood. It helps you to make your point. So if I'm trying to explain what ephemeral means, I need to give you guys some examples of stuff that actually is ephemeral. So the mayfly is an individual case that represents what this word means. And we could find other cases, other individual instances that would help us to understand the larger concept, which in this case is ephemeral. So we need examples, we get examples as part of our larger formal definition. And then if you keep scrolling down, so after you see a few examples, you'll then see some synonyms. Okay, so other words that pretty much mean the same thing as ephemeral. Different words with the same meaning. So you might see some synonyms listed like transitory, transient, fleeting, passing, temporary, or short lived. All of those words pretty much mean the same as ephemeral. Okay? Now, you should also see a link to antonyms. So you should see the synonyms right there on the page if you scroll down. On Merriam-Webster, you might have to click on the link to actually go and see antonyms, but they should give you a link if you want to see a list of antonyms, words that mean the opposite. So not permanent, or permanent. Long-lasting, right? These are words that mean the opposite. So sometimes it helps to look at those. It helps to maybe use negation a little bit. See what the word isn't. See what the opposite meaning might be. See what some of the words are that capture the opposite meaning, like permanent, long-lasting. Just to give you a better sense, again, of what the word is and also what it isn't. That's part of establishing these boundaries. Here's what the word is. Here's what it isn't. Here's how far it goes. This is all part of us kind of gaining that greater understanding. And then you're going to get some examples of the word being used in sentences. And that's always very useful to check out. So you're going to get multiple, again, these are examples of how to use a word, in this case ephemeral, in a complete sentence. So read through those. You'll get a sense of different ways that you can use the word. You can describe different things using this particular adjective. And if you're interested in using this word as a noun, you could also look more into that. We're just sticking with the adjective usage for now. But you can see a lot of different examples of how to use it in a sentence. And then within those examples, they'll give you kind of a range. Like they'll give you some older examples from decades ago. And you might be able to track changes in how the word is used, how the word has maybe evolved or changed over time. And now a more recent feature that they've added is giving you examples of how the word appears in a lot of different sentences online. So they sort of have a separate category for this where they'll kind of call it, appearances on the web or online. So these are specific uses of the word online. And that stuff tends to be more recent, a little bit more contemporary. So, that's also worth reviewing. And then usually at the very bottom, the final thing that you get as part of this larger formal definition will be the etymology of the word. So that just means the origin or the history of the word. Where did the word come from? How long has the word been around? There's a lot of interesting stuff there, and depending on how interested you are, you could dig a lot more into the word history and learn even more than what you're seeing on Merriam-Webster's website. So typically they'll tell you the first known usage of the word in the English language. Like, when is the first time we can find it, either in a written usually in a written document? When's the first time we can really verify that it was used? So in the case of ephemeral, I might be wrong on this, but I believe the first known use was like 1576 or something like that for the adjective. Now, for using it as a noun, the first known use is not until like the 1800s. So what does that tell us? For a long time, it was only an adjective. And only after a few hundred years of being used that way does it kind of morph into a different noun form. And that's not been around as long, but we can see the history of that as well. But before you get to that particular factoid, you should also see like where it comes from, the true origin of the word. So ephemeral comes from an old Greek word. And you'll notice a lot of our words come from Greek or Latin, in some cases French or other existing languages, so that's usually the first thing they'll give you for the etymology, and then they'll tell you the first known usage. Interesting to take a look at, and that's info, that's knowledge that you might be able to use later. And this week, you definitely can use it later. So there's a lot there. There's a lot more than just that simple explanation that we usually think of as all a definition is. That's a big part of it, right? We need to know that ephemeral means lasting for a very short time. But there's so much more. We can learn the synonyms. We can look at antonyms. We can look at examples of how to use the word. We can look at recent examples, older examples, and we can also learn the etymology. So we can really, in a lot of ways, become sort of experts on a particular word. And if we're interested in the history, if we want to know more about the Greek or Latin word that it comes from, we could dig more into that as well. So there's a lot there. There's a lot to appreciate. And what you should notice is by looking through all of it, you're gaining a more well-rounded, comprehensive appreciation and understanding of the word. Okay, now you know a lot about the word, maybe more than you bargained for, but you are learning and you can do stuff with that knowledge. So that's formal definitions. We're going to have some fun with those later this week. But I also want you to know what a stipulative definition is, because eventually we're going to sort of move a little bit more in the stipulative direction. We're still going to use formal dictionary definitions, but then we can start kind of putting our own spins on them a little bit, or we can start sort of personalizing our own uses of these words. And that's really what a stipulative definition is all about. So when we are stipulating a particular sort of personal definition, what that really means is we are using a word in a particular way. So to stipulate something means to make a demand or a really sort of specific sort of move or claim. So if we are stipulating, we are specifying a particular meaning that suits our purposes. So we have to walk a fine line here. We are not completely changing the meaning of the word. That's not what I'm talking about. But we can depart a little bit from the formal dictionary definition. Just a bit. Because now we're using a word to fit our own purpose, to fit whatever goals we are trying to accomplish in our writing. So oftentimes, if a word is being used to maybe capture a state of mind, to capture an opinion that we hold, a sensation that we have experienced, highly personal things that are unique to us. In those cases, when we are doing those kinds of writing activities, we can create stipulative definitions for words. Again, not completely making up a new meaning, but maybe tweaking or slightly altering the formal definition so the word can really suit our purposes. So we can use it to accomplish whatever we are trying to accomplish in our writing. So we can communicate whatever it is that we are trying to communicate. So let's go back to ephemeral for a moment. Let's say I'm writing a personal narrative, a descriptive narrative like you all did for Essay 1. And I am old, so as part of my narrative, I am thinking back to my childhood. I'm reminiscing. Perhaps I'm telling a story, something that happened to me during my childhood. So in the process of doing that, I'm sort of engaging in this sort of nostalgia. I'm thinking back to my youth. I'm thinking back to how all of that felt, but also how it feels now. And if I'm trying to capture how I feel about my childhood or how I view my childhood from my present day perch, from my present situation, I might use the word ephemeral. I might describe my childhood as seeming to be ephemeral. From my current position, from my current place in life, as I look back, it feels like it was over very quickly. It feels to me like it was very short-lived, very, very temporary, very brief, because it's been over for a long time. I've forgotten a lot of it. And also, as you get old, you just feel nostalgia. You just sort of wish sometimes that you could go back to certain chapters or moments from your youth. So I'm trying to capture a feeling. I'm trying to capture an emotion. In some ways, I'm speaking a little bit figuratively. I don't really mean it literally when I say that my childhood was ephemeral, because technically it wasn't. I mean, it was as long as anybody else's childhood, right? I didn't have to grow up super fast. I had a normal childhood. I lived at home until it was time to go off to college. So my childhood, in a literal, sort of formal sense, wasn't really that short. It was just this normal standard length. Nothing super traumatic or out of the ordinary happened to me that forced me to grow up sooner than normal. So literally, formally, it wasn't ephemeral. It was 18 years or however long we would think of it as. But I'm talking about how it feels. I'm talking about how it feels to me now as somebody much older. So I'm creating my own stipulative definition. I'm using the word ephemeral in part because it has this understood meaning. And we all know that it means temporary or short-lived, or if we don't know, we look it up and we learn it very quickly. But I'm kind of using that knowledge as part of my sort of larger goal here. I want you to think about what ephemeral means and what it normally means, but then I want you to apply that understanding to something that is not literally ephemeral, but it feels ephemeral. So now I'm capturing my mental state, my emotional state in a way that readers can understand. But you see, there is a bit of a difference between the way I would be using ephemeral in my stipulative definition compared to what I would see or use if I was sticking only with the formal definition. Another word, I try to make this somewhat relatable for young people, so a word that I notice gets used a lot nowadays is epic. A lot of people use the word epic as an adjective to describe things. It was an epic night. It was an epic game, right? We are describing things that were very fun, that were maybe sort of larger than life, and that's a word that we like to use. But, you know, in some cases, what we are describing as epic might not technically, formally, really fit the definition of epic that we would find in a dictionary. But again, we're trying to capture how something feels to us. If I went to a concert or a sporting event and had a lot of fun, it felt epic to me. Maybe that type of thing wouldn't typically be what the word would be used to describe, but I'm using a stipulative definition. I'm taking the word and sort of molding it, slightly altering it to suit my needs, to help me communicate my message or accomplish my writing goal. So even if the way I'm using epic doesn't quite square up with the formal definition, we know what I mean, we know what I'm getting at, and better yet, we know how it felt to me. The word helps to sort of indicate that larger message, even if it's not the dictionary formal definition. And see, you'll notice that it can get kind of complicated with certain words because a lot of words have a lot of different definitions. So one interesting exercise for now might be to look up the word pride, right? Because as is the case with many words, pride has a lot of different usages, and there's a lot of different connotations or associations that we have with these different words or with these different definitions or meanings of the word. And some of the connotations might be positive, some could be negative. So if you look up the word pride, you'll see that it can mean an inordinate amount of self-esteem or conceit. That's kind of negative, right? Pride comes before the fall. That's not usually thought of as good, but it can also mean reasonable or justifiable self-respect, which is a quality that we would probably have more positive views on. So we can use this word a lot of different ways. Sometimes we almost have to use a stipulative definition because we're specifying exactly what the word means for us. What is the word doing right here in our paper for us? And it might be a little bit different than the work that the word is doing in some different context. The word could also refer to a group of lions, right? So what do we mean when we say pride? Is it the bad kind of pride that you're supposed to not have? Is it the okay, good kind of pride that we're supposed to take in our work? We hear that in school. Are we talking about the animal kingdom? So sometimes you have to stipulate just because one word can mean a lot of different things. So you're making the conditions of your own. You're specifying how you're going to use this word and what the word means for you. And also, just it's worth thinking about that, we're constantly adding new words. This is not, words don't remain static. Language does not remain static. So language is always changing. We're often adding new words to our vocabulary. Sometimes those words are reflections of new technology, or just new exposure to maybe different cultures, new developments, new things that are happening. So a great example of this is, of course, the word Google, a word that we did not have several decades ago, a word that did not exist. If you went back to the 1980s and told people to Google something, they would obviously have had no idea what you were talking about. But just think about the word for a moment. Think about how versatile we've made the word Google. So on one hand, the word refers to an actual company, a physical company that exists in the world. I mean, they still have a brick and mortar location, I'm sure, but for the most part, we know it as a search engine. But it's also a company owned by, people and shareholders and CEOs or whatever. So it's a company. It's also the search engine that the company created. And that's often what we're thinking of if we say go to Google or ask Google, right? We're thinking about just the search engine, but it's also a company, right? So already multiple levels. We can also use it as a verb. Google something, right? We're using it as an action. That is something that you can do by sitting down or taking out your phone and typing words into that search bar. So it can be a verb talking about, the act of searching for information online. It can refer to the actual search engine itself, and it can also refer to the company that was created by people. So different usages, different ways that we can understand the word, but it's still a relatively new word. Right? It didn't exist decades ago. Now it does. And now we all sort of intuitively understand what it means. That's another interesting thing about definitions. Definitions kind of get agreed upon by the users of the language. I mean, yes, there are organizations like the MLA, the Modern Language Association. There were other groups a long time ago that sort of sat down and came up with a lot of these definitions, sort of standardized a lot of language, codified it. But ask any English professor or any linguist, and they'll tell you can't really contain language. You can't really control it or, fit it inside a box because, again, it's always changing. We're adding new stuff to it. Some stuff becomes obsolete and archaic. So that's another thing you'll notice, depending on what words you're looking up. Some words will be labeled as archaic or obsolete, which means they still exist, but they don't get used anymore, at least not very much. So they almost kind of just fall out of the rotation. People don't use the word isn't really adapted maybe to the modern world, so it falls out. And then it gets replaced perhaps by new words that again are inspired by new technology or other changes in our culture. So we often get to sort of decide what words mean. And we can change the meaning of words. You guys might be able to find some examples of that as well. Words that used to mean one thing hundreds of years ago, but now they largely mean something else. That original definition is not completely gone. Scholars might know it. People that are really into words might know it, but that usage is largely gone and has been replaced by a new usage or a new meaning. So that happens too. The words might not change themselves, but the meaning of the words, in many cases, can change. And these changes are often brought about simply by the majority of people in that language system. They start using it a certain way. They start understanding it a certain way, and then that's kind of the new definition or the new understanding that takes off. So just a couple more concepts to make sure you know for this week. Understand the difference between denotation and connotation, because that really matters when we're talking about definition. Denotation is just another way of referring to that formal dictionary definition. Okay, it's what the word literally means according to Merriam-Webster or, these other kinds of dictionaries. So we always need to know the denotation of a word. But then we can also play around with connotations. And like I said, the connotation is the association that the word that we sort of create in our minds when we hear the word. How does the word make us feel? Right? What immediately comes to mind, when we think about the word? So sometimes the connotations can differ a little bit from denotation. Again, the denotation is just the formal definition that we can look up. But a connotation is more about how a word makes us feel. Right? What a word makes us think about. And sometimes a word can have positive connotations. In other cases, it might have more negative. In many cases, like the connotation, like the differences in connotation can't really be located in the denotation. The definition stays the same, but depending on how we're using the word, depending on how we personally feel about the word, there will be different kinds of connotations. So connotations are very personal. They're very subjective, and they're very much based on the author, but you often want to try to sort of land on some connotations that are going to make sense to readers as well. So often, again, we're sort of working together as users of a language system, and we kind of know this word has a positive connotation, and this other word, maybe a synonym, similar meaning, has a very different connotation that might make us feel a very different way. So that's one of the exercises that I would like you guys to go through this week. So we are going to do a little research project on a word of our choosing. So you get a break from our reading assignments this week. I'm not giving you a text to read. Instead, I want you to dig into a particular word. So we are just sticking with the definitions of words this week. So pick a word. It needs to be kind of an interesting or somewhat complex word. As you can imagine, we can't get a ton of mileage out of really simple words that have really simple definitions. So you might want to think about some SAT words or some kind of big words that maybe you had to learn for a vocabulary test back in high school, or even go through a text that you like, or it could even be something that we've read in this semester, for this class. Maybe you came across some words in Ellison or, in something that we read back in Unit 1 that, you found some cool words or some words that you didn't know, some words that you had to look up and found them to be somewhat interesting. Or it could be a word that you really like, a word that maybe you learned years ago and you use it fairly often, a word that might have something to do with a hobby or a particular interest of yours. It could be a word that's really sort of directly connected to your discipline, your academic field that you're going into, your major. Another word that you might know is jargon, right? Specialized vocabulary that goes along with a particular work type of work or career or academic discipline or just a particular walk of life. So like computer programming has its own jargon. There are certain words and phrases that wouldn't really make sense to people outside of that world unless it was getting explained to them. So you might even pick something that could be considered jargon. Maybe it's a specialized term that really only refers to it's really only about auto mechanics or computers or some other particular hobby or discipline that you know a lot about. Sportsmen have their own jargon. Fishing, hunting, sports, if you like competitive sports, there's kind of, different sports have their own terms. They have their own words. And in some cases, they use the same words, but the words mean different things in different sports, or they have different connotations depending on the sport or the situation in which they are being used. So try to make a good choice, but it really doesn't matter as long as the word gives you a lot of good material to work with. So I want you to basically account for everything that I've talked about today as part of the formal definition. So go to Merriam-Webster and kind of just go in the same order if you can based on what I've given you here and in the Week 9 module. So start with the classification. What kind of speech is it? Then you can provide the pronunciation. It can be you pronouncing it, or you can just spell it out phonetically. Give us the actual explanation that you see on the website so you can take it as it is. Okay, for this first part, you are largely copying what you're seeing in the formal definition in Merriam-Webster. So kind of recreate all of this. The classification, the pronunciation, the explanation, the definition itself, and then give me some synonyms. Give me those examples. Give me the examples of the word being used in sentences. Okay, now I would like you to create some examples of your own. You can use one or two from the site, but then try to branch off and make some of your own. And then give me some synonyms. Maybe include some antonyms if they're easy to find or if you can think of some. And then give me a sort of condensed version of the etymology. Okay, where does the word come from? Like, what language does it originally come from? We have a lot of loan words in the English language, so Greek, Latin, maybe something else, maybe a Romance language. Tell us that, and then give us that first known usage of the word. And that's just kind of interesting to think about. How long has it been around? How long have we been using it? And think about maybe some possible changes that have occurred to that definition over time. All right. So once you've done all that, that's simple enough. You can find it all on the website. The next step is to start thinking about connotations. Start thinking about ways that you might use this word, kind of like what the word means to you, how the word functions for you, and then finally, I want you to provide your own stipulative definition of the word. How would you use it to accomplish something? How would you use it to describe something, explain something? Again, maybe it's a state of mind, maybe it's an opinion. It's going to be pretty personal, pretty subjective, very much based on you, your own knowledge, your own experience, and your own relationship with this word. So that's pretty much what you're doing for this week's discussion post. Read through my instructions. You really just need to read about the word. That's the reading that we're doing this week. You might really get deep into it. You might find a lot of cool stuff online. I'm okay with you doing some additional online research. Just find out as much as you can about the word. But eventually, we're going to move away from the formal definition and we're going to focus a little bit more on creating our own stipulative definitions. And again, don't think of that as just remaking the definition from scratch. You're not completely changing what the word means. You're just finding a specific usage that would work for you, a way that you want to use the word, and you're kind of molding it, like I said, slightly altering it, trimming it, making it fit your purposes. So that's the final step for this week's post. So this should be kind of fun, not so much based on an outside reading, just based on your own research and what you're able to learn and then come up with about this word. So pick a good word. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you next week.